In this lesson, we're going to explore how we can use photon-based global illumination to add realistic indirect lighting to our rendered scenes. Alright, so the term photon may actually sound familiar to you. You've probably heard this term used before in maybe physics or just general scientific discussions that relate to light. So basically, in real life, a photon is an individual packet or an individual particle of light, and they have some kind of energy associated with them based on the intensity of the light source. So in real life, the way that these photons work is they are actually radiated from some kind of a light source, and they can actually interact with surfaces. So a photon can actually bounce around our surroundings, and all the while they can take surface information from the objects that they interact with. So what that basically means is that if we have some kind of a room like this, if we have photons that are bouncing off and interacting with some kind of a blue surface, we should see some kind of a light spill on a white surface. So we should actually get a little bit of a blue tint down here, and that's exactly how a photon works. It'll bounce off, interact with this surface, and actually take some of the lighting information with it as it interacts with the next surface, and so on and so forth. That's how a photon works in real life, and really that's exactly how a photon works in mental ray as well. But by default, whenever we render something in mental ray, the photons are not active, so it's actually something that we do have to go in and control. Alright, so just for comparison's sake, let's take a render at what we have. So let's check back on our render setup and make sure that we are set to use the mental ray renderer. Once we do that, we can either render from down here in this lower corner, or we can use this button down here, Render Production. Alright, so this is what we get. Just basic direct illumination, no light bouncing whatsoever happening. We have one light source in this scene, which is basically responsible for this direct illumination. We got a little bit of shadow in here as well. Alright, so what we need to do is first go back to our render setup. We can actually get to it from here if we have this render current frame window open. So we'll pop this open. We're going to go over to the indirect illumination tab. Scroll down a little bit, and we're going to look for Global Illumination, or GI. So let's start by enabling this, and let's see what we have now. Alright, so immediately you can see that we have this big blown out render, lots and lots of lighting in our scene. So this is really kind of a twofold problem, or there's actually two causes to this. Number one is our direct light source is probably too intense. And that direct light source is what is actually controlling the intensity of these photons. So let's start by going to the illumination source, this light source here. Go over to the Modify panel. And let's start by first maybe giving this a little bit of light decay. Right now, by default, these lights don't have any kind of decay, and that's really not the way that lights behave in real life. In real life, the further away an object is from a light source, the less illumination it's actually going to receive. So what we can do is use something like the near and far attenuation in this light to actually control this. So right now I've got mine set to the point where we get pretty much direct illumination just past this object, and then as we start to get further toward this far attenuation, we should actually lose all our illumination by the time we reach the back of this room. So I'm going to re-render this. I'm actually going to use my keyboard shortcut to pull up the render, which is Shift-Q. Alright, and you'll notice that when I use this Shift-Q keyboard shortcut, it'll actually render whatever viewport I have currently active. So if I have my top viewport active, I use Shift-Q. It's going to render from that top view. Alright. I'm going to render this from the perspective view, and actually what I'm going to do is use this lock to viewport option. So that way, whichever viewport I have active, it will always render from this perspective view, since that's when I have it locked to. Alright, so you can see still, even with this direct illumination sort of toned down a little bit, we still have a lot of big blown out areas. So we can start to actually dial down the intensity of this light. So let's take the intensity multiplier, and let's start by maybe cutting this in half. All right, let's see what that does for us. Getting a little bit better, but you can start to see how there is a very direct correlation between the intensity of the light and the intensity of the photons that are actually being emitted from it. So let's re-render that. There we go. All right, now you notice right now that we are starting to now get a little bit of this color bouncing and some of this color bleeding effect, but overall this is a very noisy result. We got a lot of this sort of a blotchy behavior. And what we're seeing right now are the individual photons actually trying to be blended together and kind of smooth out the results. Now we can actually see this if we go back to our render setup and back in our direct illumination tab or our indirect illumination tab. Let's go back to the global illumination settings, and if we actually want to see what these individual photons look like, we can actually start to give it some kind of a maximum sampling radius. Right now it's set to be off, so it just kind of automatically determines what the best radius should be. Basically what that's going to say is that each individual photon is going to look within a certain radius for other photons and kind of blend themselves and average themselves together over whatever this distance may be. Now, if we dial this distance way down to a very low value, what we should start to see are now the individual points. And that's actually pretty small, so let's maybe drop that down a little bit more, maybe something like 0.1. There we go. So now, because we have such a tiny radius, we can actually see the individual photons in our scene. So it kind of gives us a little bit better idea of exactly what is happening. We have these photons that are sort of bouncing around and landing every which way. So you can see we have a few blue, kind of blue photons right down in here, and these are probably being bounced off of this blue surface. And same back here, we have a lot of these red photons, which are probably being bounced off of this red surface. All right, and through this radius control, what that's basically going to do is, kind of like I said, each one of these individual photons is going to look within a certain radius of itself and try to sort of blend itself together with the colors of the surrounding photons, and that's kind of how we get this averaging effect. Now, when it comes to actually smoothing out and getting a nice global illumination result, there are a couple of different methods that we can go about doing this. One is to go back to the sampling radius and actually start to define some kind of a sampling radius. So now you can see that with a little bit higher radius, they start to sort of look within a larger area and blend themselves together a little bit better. Although this is probably not going to be quite high enough, so we can always start to take this value up a little bit higher. And you can see the higher we go, the smoother our results start to get. So it's kind of a twofold process. The higher that we go, the smoother our result, but at the same time we start to lose a little bit of accuracy because we are starting to look within such a large area. The other thing that we can do is actually increase the number of photons that this light is going to emit. So if we scroll down a little bit further, underneath the light properties inside this indirect illumination tab, we have an average GI photons per light. So each light, in our case we only have the one light, it is actually emitting about 20,000 of these GI photons. Now, one thing that is important to note is that once we enable the GI in our render setup, every light that we have in our scene is going to be emitting these numbers of photons. So the more lights we have, the more photons we're going to have, the slower your renders are probably going to be. So it is very important to actually look at this. We can come in and actually start to override this. So let's say maybe instead of 20,000 photons, we just want 200. You can now see we have just a very, very kind of ugly, blotchy result. That's way, way lower than you'd probably ever want to have it, but I just wanted to show you that for demonstration's sake. So we can always increase this. Let's say maybe instead of 20,000, we go to 200,000. As this number starts to get a little bit higher, you will start to notice some more slowdown. But you can see overall, this is starting to now clean up a little bit better. All right, and finally, just below that, we have the decay. Now, what this number controls is the amount of energy that is lost from these photons as they travel through space. Again, this is going to correlate to a real-life property of something that is a lot further away from the light source is going to receive a lot less illumination. So really, what that's saying is with this decay rate, the higher the number, the faster these photons are going to lose energy as they travel through space. So if you find that, maybe overall this is way too bright, we could always start to take this and maybe increase this decay so that way they actually lose their energy faster, these individual photons. Now this is something that very small adjustments do make a pretty drastic change. You can see by just a very small amount, we can start to inflict some pretty major changes in the overall indirect lighting of this scene. All right. So what we've looked at right now, up to this point in this lesson, are some of these global properties of global illumination. The radius, the number of photons, the energy, things like that. So what we're going to do now in the next lesson is take a look at some of the individual light attributes of these global illumination photons. So we're going to take a look at those in this next lesson.